Dark Knight is for one of two people. People who love big swords, or people who live on the edge, literally. If either of those totally real descriptors that I didn't make up fit you, then oh boy, Dark Knight is for you. Dark Knight is one of the 4 tanks of Final Fantasy XIV introduced all the way back in Heavensward, and has been for the self-loathing ever since. The job has had quite a history that I don't claim to understand, and recently has been quite the talk of the town in terms of, well, bad design. However, despite that, the job still performs pretty well at top level. So if you want to play it because the other jobs don't speak to you, then this is the guide for you. The way this will be structured is very similar to my previous guides. First, I will talk about every skill Dark Knight has up to level 50, including roll actions because tank roll actions are very important. After that, I will talk about everything the job has in sequential order as you level up, all the way to 100, and then finally we'll have a max level section to talk about how the job completes itself at level 100, on top of any other tips and tricks I may have. If you want to jump to a specific level range, or you just want to see the max level stuff, there will be timestamps in the description for you to be able to jump around however you want. And with all that established, let's get into it. One of the most important skills for Dark Knight is obtained at level 10. Grit is your tank stance, and needs to be on whenever you're tanking enemies. While the Reaper may also be brooding as much as you are, you're the original, and you're the one that can actually take hits. In terms of dealing damage, you have your 1-2-3 combo of Hard Slash into Siphon Strike into Soul Eater. For AoE damage, you have Unleash into Stalwart Soul, and for ranged you have Unmend. At level 30, you gain one of your main job mechanics off of the skill Flood of Darkness. Flood of Darkness shoots a line AoE in front of you for 100 potency, and also gives you an effect called Dark Side. Dark Side is a weird job thing, not a buff. Technically, it's weird, but it gives you 10% more damage on everything. Similar to Warrior, but done in a different way. Flood of Darkness also costs 3,000 MP to use, so you're actually going to be needing to pay attention to your MP to use it. Thankfully, Siphon Strike and Stalwart Soul give you MP back, 600 to be exact. So in AoE, you'll get your MP back every second GCD, and in your 1-2-3 combo, you'll get it back every third. At level 40, you also gain the single target version, Edge of Darkness, which hits for 300 potency as opposed to 100, and this is basically just used on single targets. However, it also gives you the dark side effect. At level 35, you gain access to Blood Weapon. Blood Weapon gives you 3 stacks of the buff, and for the next 3 GCDs, you will gain 600 MP back per weapon skill. This also stacks with the existing MP gain off of Siphon Strike and Stalwart Soul, so those GCDs will give you 1200 MP back instead of just the 600. And that's basically it for Dark Knight at level 50. Really all it is using Blood Weapon every 60 seconds, using your 1-2-3 combo, and then using Edge of Darkness for single target and Flood of Darkness for AoE. Since there's no real reason to hold MP at this level, you'll just use it as it comes up. In terms of unique defense, Dark Knight has a couple things. First, it has access to Shadow Wall, which is your typical 30% damage mitigation for 15 seconds that every tank has. Not much else to say there, it's a pretty strong mitigation tool. At level 45, you gain Dark Mind, which is either one of the most important skills in Dark Knight's arsenal, or is incredibly worthless. It reduces magic damage that you take by 20% for 10 seconds on a 60-second cooldown. This means if you deal with magic damage tank busters, then Dark Mind helps a lot, and gives Dark Knight an extra option that no other tank has. However, if it's a physical damage tank buster, you might as well take Dark Mind off your hotbar. And finally at level 50, you gain one of the wordiest tooltips I've ever fucking seen in Living Dead.
Wow, that's a lot of words. Too bad I'm not reading them.
Living Dead is similar to Holmgang, in which you press the button and you cannot be reduced below 1 HP. However, when you do reach 1 HP, that's when the wacky shit happens. You gain a debuff called Walking Dead, which has two things to it. First, you need to restore HP. Specifically, you need to restore an amount equal to your maximum health. So let's say, for example, you have 10,000 HP. You need to be healed for 10,000 HP. Thankfully, that's made a little bit easier because under the effect of Walking Dead, every GCD you land heals you for a 1,500 potency heal, which is a little wacky. Once you heal that amount, Walking Dead turns into Undead Rebirth for the remainder of the duration, which just keeps the invulnerability part. If you don't restore the HP while under Walking Dead somehow, then you die, which is great. This skill used to be a healer's personal nightmare, but now is a pretty neat tool that has some RNG to it at higher levels, so it's a safer call for healers to just heal you a little bit. Your self-heal helps, but isn't self-sufficient, so your healer will need to help you out a little bit. And that's it for Dark Knight at level 50. It's a very straightforward job. Even more straightforward than other tanks, if you could believe it. However, we're not done yet because we still have role actions to talk about. Hey, remember those? First, you have Rampart, which is a 20% damage mitigation for 20 seconds. This goes hand in hand with Unleash. This goes hand in hand with Shadow Wall. This is why I should have an actual screen. These two buttons go hand in hand for mitigation in dungeons and for tank busters, so keep them on hand at all times. Next, you have Low Blow, which is a stun. It's mainly useful in dungeons and low-level bosses that can be stunned, so keep it on hand for that, but don't expect to use it much else elsewhere. Next, you have Provoke, which is extremely important. It takes the enemy's aggro list, puts you at the top, and also gives you a little bit extra, to make sure that when you use Provoke on an enemy that they're going to be attacking you. This is mainly used for tank busters, or on enemies that you missed in a dungeon pull when you're trying to pull everything. Next, you have Interject. Some skills have a red flashing cast bar like this, which indicates that a skill like Interject can be used to interrupt them. You'll mainly use this in lower level dungeons if certain skills have it, or if you plan on taking this into Dragonsong's Reprise Ultimate. Then this skill is required for that. Next, you gain Reprisal, which is a very important skill. Every enemy around you will deal 10% less damage while it's up. So you'll use this for raid-wide damage in raids, or you'll use it on dungeon pulls to make every enemy around you deal less damage, because 10% less damage from 10 sources is a lot of damage mitigation. Just saying. Speaking of good damage mitigation for dungeons, Arm's Length. You'll mainly use this for knockback prevention in high-end raids, but in dungeon pulls, when enemies hit you, they'll be inflicted with a slow, which makes them auto-attack 20% slower, so you'll take less damage. Hey, Arms Length is damage mitigation. Like, for real. So, please use it. It's so important. For the love of God. And finally, at level 48, you have Shirk, which takes 25% of your current aggro and puts it on another target. And hopefully, that other target is a tank. This is also used in tank swaps similar to Provoke, where one tank provokes, and then the other one uses Shirk to make sure that they have a comfortable aggro lead. That way, you don't accidentally steal it back. And really, that's it for Dark Knight. It's a very simple tank, probably the simplest of the bunch at level 50. It's really just getting your MP back with Blood Weapon, and then using Flood and Edge of Darkness to keep Darkside up at all times. That's basically it. So let's move on to the next level range, where we get some more fun skills. At level 52, you gain Salted Earth, which puts a patch of salted earth down on the ground, aka this little red poop puddle, and whenever enemies are in it, they will take a 50 potency damage over time effect while in it. The damage might sound pathetic, and it is. However, it's pretty nice for AoE damage, because that's a DOT on multiple targets, so it's pretty neat in dungeons. Other than that, it's a pretty simple skill. It also has a weird 90-second cooldown, however, it doesn't change the fact that you just press it on cooldown. Not much else to say. At level 54, you gain Shadow Stride, which is a new skill introduced in Dawntrail, which replaces Plunge. Thank God. Shadow Stride is a non-damaging gap closer that also inflicts a weird little non-damaging attack that generates aggro when you dash to something. Its main use is for doing all sorts of dashing across the map that you wouldn't be able to do before because Plunge was used for damage only. Shadow Stride allows you to run away from a boss and then dash back immediately when an AoE goes off, and not have to worry about counting stacks. It's a utility move, and you know what they say, gap closers should be used for utility, and this one is. At level 56, you gain Abyssal Drain, which is one of the most controversial skills in this job to load out, mainly because this button sucks, and half of it isn't even its fault. You throw an AoE on a target, and every enemy around it takes 240 potency. You also heal 200 potency for every enemy hit, which is a decent heal at lower levels, but at higher levels it falls off. On top of that, it's also on a 60-second cooldown, and shares a cooldown with the next skill, Carve and Spit. Carve and Spit is a 510 potency single target attack that also gives you MP back.
Oh yeah, I also forgot, Abyssal Drain also gives MP back as well.
Because these two share a cooldown, you basically pick between Carve and Spit and Abyssal Drain. Use Carve and Spit for single target and Abyssal Drain for AoE. That's really it. And that's it for Dark Knight at level 60. The job basically doesn't change. It gains a couple new buttons that you use for damage. Abyssal Drain is used for AoE dungeon pulls, which also gives you a bit of health back upon use, and Carve and Spit is this extra single target damage. Not really much else to say here. However, I will have a lot more to say in the next level range because that's where some of your biggest skills come from. At level 62, you gain the trait Black Blood, which gives you your blood gauge, which is one of the most important and central things to Dark Knight. Well, that and the MP thing. Now when you use Stalwart Soul and Soul Eater in a combo, they will give you 20 gauge. Once you have 50, you get to use the skill Blood Spiller, which is a fairly powerful single target attack. And then at level 64, you'll also be able to use Quietus with gauge. So you'll have Blood Spiller for single target and Quietus for AoE. This is fairly similar to Warrior's Gauge, except you don't have an Infuriate equivalent, so you'll just be gaining it from doing your combos. However, at level 66, that changes a little bit because of the trait Enhanced Black Blood. Enhanced Black Blood makes it so whenever you use Blood Weapon, now every weapon skill you use gives you 10 gauge on top of the MP it already gained. And just like the MP, it also stacks. So you use it with Soul Eater gives you 20, and then the Blood Weapon effect gives you an extra 10 for a total of 30. This just makes you gain gauge a lot faster, so you can use more Blood Spiller and more Quietus, which is very nice. And speaking of more Blood Spiller and Quietus, at level 68, you gain the trait Blood Weapon Mastery, which upgrades Blood Weapon to Delirium. You still have the effects of Blood Weapon. Everything gives you 600 MP, everything gives you 10 gauge, but now Delirium is an extra effect where the next 3 uses of Blood Spiller and Quietus are free, while also giving you gauge back. This is a unique case where your gauge spender also gives you that resource back. And on top of that, every use of Blood Spiller and Quietus under this effect gives you 200 MP back at the same time. So that's a total of 800 MP back per weapon skill, provided you also have your Blood Weapon stacks on it. This means the total amount of MP Blood Weapon gives you goes up from 1,800 to 2,400, which is pretty nice. And then finally at level 70, MP management actually becomes important with the introduction of the Blackest Night. The Blackest Night puts a 25% HP shield on you or whatever target you pick. Once that shield breaks, or rather if that shield breaks before it wears off, you then gain a buff called Dark Arts, which allows you to use Flood or Edge of Darkness for free. The Blackest Night is another controversial skill in Dark Knight's kit, and while you can make an argument of whether the skill's good or bad, it's still a pretty big shield that scales with your HP at the end of the day. It's pretty useful when it comes to saving runs because you can put it on another player, either for tank busters or because they have low HP because they took damage from something and need help. You do need to be careful because if the shield doesn't break and wears off, you don't gain the Dark Arts buff. So you've effectively wasted 3000 MP, and that's a damage loss. This also means you'll need to be careful with how much MP you have at one time. I'll go into more depth on this later, but the simple version is that you want to usually hover between 3000 to 6000 MP. That way, if the Blackest Night is used for a tank buster or a saving a run type deal, then you have it available ready to go. And then once you have above 6000 MP, then you can just freely use an Edge of Shadow for free. Wait, that's the wrong skill, that's what you get later. At level 74, you gain the trait Dark Side Mastery, which upgrades Flood of Darkness to Flood of Shadow, and Edge of Darkness to Edge of Shadow. This just means that the skills now have more damage and a more flashy animation. That's basically it. They function the same, they have the same MP cost, they still give you Dark Side, so just, yeah, more damage. You'll love to see it. At level 76, you gain a skill that you should have had 6 levels ago, in the form of Dark Missionary. Dark Missionary is your raid-wide utility, which makes everyone in the party take 10% less magic damage. This is extremely important for raid-wide damage, since the vast majority of raid-wides, unless you're doing the current raid tier, is magic damage, so this comes in very handy with mitigating damage. There's not a whole lot to the skill other than it's very important, so use it. And finally at level 80, you gain the skill Living Shadow. Living Shadow summons Esteem to fight alongside you after taking his sweet ass time to be summoned. Like, dude, I don't have all day. Get the fuck up! Once bro finally gets up from his power nap, he'll start doing attacks on his own, with each attack doing 340 potency. And he also retains the same buffs that you have if you have damage buffs. So when he's actually doing damage, he's a very important part of your burst damage. He also helps a little bit with AoE because he also uses like Flood of Shadow and Abyssal Drain, which is nice. The main deal with him is just use him when the fight starts, like as you pull, that way by the time he's actually up, you'll have your damage buffs up from the rest of the party, and that way he'll be affected by them. And then he'll just go to town. And if he's also summoned far away from the target, he will also Shadow Stride to the target. And that's really it at level 80. Dark Knight's still very simple. The gauge thing doesn't change, the MP thing doesn't change, you just have an extra shiny button, a skill you should have had by now, and some funny upgrades. At level 82, you gain Oblation, which is another damage mitigation tool. This technically means you have more self-damage mitigation tools than any other tank, since you have Shadow Wall, Rampart, the Blackest Night, Dark Mind half the time, and Oblation, totaling up to 5, where every other tank normally has 4. Additionally, Oblation is only a 10% damage mitigation, which is not the best by itself. However, you can put it on other players, and it has 2 charges. This makes it useful for stuff like, for example, tank busters on both tanks, where you can Oblation yourself, Oblation the other tank, and then either give the Blackest Night to yourself or the other tank. The choice is really yours, depending on the situation. It gives you a lot of damage mitigation across multiple targets that only Paladin can match. And while Paladin's individual buttons may still be better, that doesn't mean that these buttons on Dark Knight are doing nothing. They're certainly helping. At level 86, you gain Salt and Darkness. Wait, there's stuff at level 84? Oh, right! Level 84 is one of the most useless levels of any job in the game. First, you gain Melee Mastery, which increases the damage of your 1-2-3 combo. Hooray! You also gain Enhanced Unmend, which was useless when it was implemented in Heavensward, and is equally as useless when it was reintroduced in Endwalker. Holy fuck, this trait sucks. At level 86, you gain Salted Darkness, which is a follow-up to Salted Earth. It allows you to do an extra AoE where the Salted Earth is for 500 potency on the first target, aka the one closest to the middle, and 50% less for everything else. Fun fact, this is one of those skills that actually uses the action change setting. What this means is that you can use Salted Earth as one button on your hotbar, and then Salted Darkness as a different button. Or, alternatively, you can have it just as it was in Endwalker, where Salted Earth turns into Salted Darkness. There's also an extra option to have an extra cooldown applied during the transition. That way, you press Salted Earth, and then don't accidentally weave Salted Darkness afterwards. I recommend turning that on, because it's very nice to not accidentally press two buttons at once and then fuck up your weaving. Levels 88 and 90 basically just give your Living Shadow a whole lot of extra juice. First is Enhanced Living Shadow at 88, which increases the potency of every Living Shadow action to 420. Nice. Both in terms of funny number and in terms of that's a lot of extra damage per weapon skill. But we're not done, because Enhanced Living Shadow 2 at level 90 also does a funny thing. It takes Flood of Shadow from its rotation and turns it into a new skill called Shadowbringer. Shadowbringer, for Living Shadow, does a 570 line AoE in front of it and only has 25% damage fall off. So you gain extra damage for AoE on Living Shadow, and just extra damage in general. Oh yeah, by the way, you also get to use the skill Shadowbringer. Shadowbringer for you is a 600 potency line AoE with 50% damage fall off, and has 2 charges. The only caveat is that you need to have Darkside active to be able to use it, which, if you're playing properly, is basically a non-issue. Shadowbringer helps give your burst a lot more extra juice. You already had a pretty good burst at level 80 thanks to Living Shadow, but Shadowbringer helps that even further, since this is your highest potency skill at this point in 600, and you have 2 uses of it. We'll go more into how busy Dark Knight's burst is at the max level section, but know right now that with Carven Spit, Living Shadow, Shadowbringer, and Salted Earth on top of multiple uses of Edge of Shadow, your burst is pretty busy at this point, and it only gets better, or worse, depending on how you look at it, in the next level range. At level 92, you gain Shadow Wall Mastery, which upgrades Shadow Wall into Shadowed Vigil. This is that tank upgrade where your 30% mitigation goes to a 40% mitigation, and gains an extra effect. In this case, Shadowed Vigil has an Excogitation effect, which is a 1200 potency heal if you are below 50% health, or the buff wears off. This is kind of similar to Gunbreaker's Heart of Corundum, where it helps a lot with hard-hitting tank busters, or specifically multi-hit tank busters, because you get a fat heal in the middle of it. It's a lot less useful, because Shadowed Vigil is a 120 second cooldown, and Heart of Corundum is 25, but hey, the sentiment's there, and it does help. At level 94, you gain Enhanced Rampart, which makes Rampart give you an extra effect, which makes you receive 15% more healing for the duration. Not much else to say here. It has some synergy with Scholars for bigger shields, and also just gives you more healing during the duration. What else is there to say? Also at level 94, you gain Melee Mastery 2, which is a little more useful than the first. I don't know why they decided to up the potency of Quietus and Stalwart Soul in this, but they did. They also buffed the potency of your 1-2-3 combo by pretty monstrous amounts, like 100 potency plus each, on top of plus 80 on Bloodspiller. And with the recent 7.05 patch, Carven Spit also gets an extra 30 potency with this trait. This is just extra damage for your filler, which is already one of Dark Knight's weakest points, so it does help a little bit. Level 96 is when Dark Knight becomes fun to watch, because you gain the trait Enhanced Delirium. When you use Delirium, Blood Spiller is temporarily upgraded to Scarlet Delirium, which unlocks a new 1-2-3 combo of Scarlet Delirium into Comeuppance into Tor Cleaver. Functionally, it's exactly the same because you just press the same button. The difference is that you have 3 skills with brand new animations and increasing potency. With Scarlet Delirium having 600 potency, Comeuppance having 700, and Tor Cleaver having 800, which is already more than you had at level 90, which is pretty nice. Also, within the same breath, when you use Enhanced Delirium, it also upgrades Quietus to Impalement, which doesn't have a 3-part combo, it's just the same skill 3 times like before, but with a new animation and more damage. And 320 potency for an AoE with no damage fall off is pretty high. So it's a lot more AoE damage, which is something that Dark Knight was already pretty strong at, all things considered. At level 98, you gain Enhanced Reprisal, which makes Reprisals effect go from 10 seconds to 15 seconds. This is mainly useful for just covering more damage. In dungeons, it makes you take less damage for longer, and for raid-wides, it helps with multi-damage raid-wides, so everyone takes less damage for longer. Just a very nice thing to have. And finally, level 100, you gain Enhanced Living Shadow 3, because I guess they just love Esteem for some reason. This trait does a couple of things. First, it upgrades Carven Spit in Living Shadow's rotation to Disesteem, which is a 620 line AoE in front of it, and only has a 25% fall off similar to Shadowbringer. It also gives you a buff called Scorn upon use, which also allows you to use the skill Disesteem. For you, Disesteem is a 1000 potency AoE in front of you with 50% damage fall off. So that's still 500 potency for every enemy that isn't the main target. One thing that Dark Knight wasn't lacking is AoE damage, and they sure aren't with this skill. And for single target damage, 1000 potency is still a lot, because that's the equivalent of Paladin's Blade of Honor. Similar to Salted Earth and Assault in Darkness, you can change it to where Living Shadow turns into Disesteem upon use, or have Disesteem as a separate button on your hotbar. However, I keep it as the same button because it's just easier for me, and I'm already starved for hotbar space on this job as is. And so with all that being said, let's talk about how the job works at level 100. It's a lot simpler than the others, trust me. In terms of Dark Knight's opener, it's a little weird. First, provided Blackest Night will break in the first couple of seconds in the fight, you'll pre-pull Blackest Night either on yourself if you're main tanking, or on the other person if you're off tanking. You'll pull with Unmend when there's 1 second left, then weave in a potion before then hitting the boss. You'll then use Hard Slash, weave in Edge of Shadow immediately, so that way you have your Dark Side buff running, and then use Living Shadow. We'll talk more about that in a moment. You'll then continue your 1-2-3 combo, Siphon Strike into Soul Eater, weave in Delirium afterwards, then this is where the fun begins. You'll then use Disesteem, weave in Salted Earth and Edge of Shadow. Use Scarlet Delirium, Shadowbringer, Edge of Shadow, Comeuppance, Carven Spit, Edge of Shadow, Tor Cleaver, second Shadowbringer, Edge of Shadow, and then you'll use your final Blood Spiller, and then put in Salt and Darkness. The reason why Living Shadow is placed where it is because of the entrance animation that he has. Since the skill no longer costs gauge, you can use it early, and then by the time he starts attacking, that's when party buffs are going to start coming out. That way we maximize the use of party buffs under his effect. So that way all of his skills actually do maximum damage. You're also trying to use as many Edge of Shadows as possible with your current MP. Since you're gaining MP back with Blood Weapon and Delirium, you'll be getting a lot of usage of Edge of Shadow. And hopefully you'll have another extra use from your Blackest Night breaking. If it's not going to happen because the fight doesn't hit hard enough at the start, then you can just ignore the Blackest Night entirely. The reason why that's done is so that way you aren't at max MP at all, since you'll lose an MP tick sometimes when you start the fight, and just lose a little bit of MP. It's small, but it can be significant. After your opener is where the job gets a whole lot simpler. You're basically just using your 1-2-3 combo, and then once you have enough gauge, we'll use a Blood Spiller. In terms of your MP usage, you'll typically keep anywhere within the range of 3,000 to 6,000 MP on hand just in case. This is in case stuff like tank busters come up, or an emergency happens and you need to use the Blackest Night to help somebody. This way, you aren't sitting there like, oh, let me TBN that guy. Shit, I have no MP. This circumvents that issue, and once you reach 6,000 MP or more, you can freely use an Edge of Shadow without having to worry. In terms of your gauge management, it's really just the case of, once you enter Delirium, you need to have 70 gauge or less. Any higher than that and you're going to lose gauge, so don't do that. However, still try to have somewhere around 50 to 60, that way once your Scarlet Delirium combo is over, you'll be able to use a Blood Spiller afterwards for extra damage, especially in even numbered bursts. In terms of your odd minute burst, there really isn't much to it. You just use Delirium, you'll get your Scarlet Delirium combo, and then you'll potentially have a couple uses of Edge of Shadow, and a Carve and Spit in there as well. You don't really have a whole lot of burst in your odd minutes, it's all in your even minutes. Speaking of your even minutes, you'll want to save Shadowbringer both stacks for that, because the more amount of damage you can pump in that burst phase, the better. Additionally, you'll typically want to press Living Shadow on cooldown, since after its initial use, it'll come back up, and there'll be a similar timing to where by the time he gets up, the damage buffs will all be coming out, and then he'll start doing as much damage as possible. As for Salted Earth, just use it whenever it comes up. There may be rare situations where you want to hold it because the boss is moving around, because like the boss is being moved around for something like Alarm Pheromones 1 for example. However, you'll typically just be pressing it on cooldown 9 times out of 10. And really the last thing to note in terms of offense is the fact that Disesteem has a lot of extra range. Because it has a 10 yalm range, you can actually use this at a decent distance away from the target, giving Dark Knight some pseudo range utility. This means that if you have to walk away from the boss during a 2-minute burst, it can be wise to save Disesteem for that moment, and then use it when you're away from the boss. That way you're still keeping full uptime in your burst, and then continuing it as normal. And surprisingly, that's it for the offense. Dark Knight is very simple on the offense. In terms of defense, it's not that much different. You'll have Shadowed Vigil for tank busters, and is effectively your best option because it gives you the most commit, plus gives you that Excog, which is nice. You'll also typically combine this with a Blackest Night and an Oblation for maximum damage reduction. Rampart is mainly used as an alternate option for tank busters if you're, say, running into a fight with multiple tank busters in a short span of time. So that'll need to come up alongside Shadowed Vigil, plus you'll have multiple uses of Oblation ready to go. Dark Mind is only really used when you have a magical damage tank buster. If one of those comes up, then you'll want to weave in Dark Mind alongside everything else, that way you'll take as little damage as possible. However, if it's physical damage, then throw Dark Mind in the trash. Also remember that the Blackest Night and Oblation are buddy mit options, so you can use Oblation on yourself and your co-tank if you're both taking busters at the same time, or put them on a DPS or a healer if they have a phone stack and are about to die to a raid wide. TBN is typically better for that because 25% extra effective HP is better than just a 10% damage mid. Also, a cheeky thing you can do with the Blackest Night is if the shield breaks, you can hold the Dark Arts buff for your free Edge or Flood of Shadow as long as you want. There's no timer on it, so you can sometimes hold it for buff windows if that comes up. Though be careful with this, because if you use another Blackest Night and it breaks, then it overwrites the one you currently have and you just wasted damage. So be careful with that. For raid-wide damage, you'll have Reprisal and a Dark Missionary. Do keep in mind what kind of damage is going out. For a fight like, say, Valley Garmanda Extreme, which is the background footage, Dark Missionary works out phenomenally because pretty much all of his damage, with a couple exceptions, is magical. So this skill comes into play a lot. However, for a fight like Brute Bomber Savage, Most of his damage is physical, so good luck finding uses for it. It can be done, there are spots where it can be used, but you'll have to actually look for them and think about them. And that's really it for Dark Knight. This job is, I don't know, it's my least favorite of the tanks by far. It's a fairly simple job to play, but for me it's not really that exciting or fun to play outside of the 2-minute burst. However, if this job speaks to you, then I hope this guide does help. Despite all the negative things I've probably said throughout this guide, and basically what I'm saying right now, the job still has good results. It still does good damage, and its defensive tools, while technically outclassed by some of its contemporaries, are still strong and help the party in multiple ways. Don't let people hamper your enjoyment of this job if you like it. It's your personal opinion, and you should be allowed to have it, even if other people will disagree with you. Yeah, that's gonna be it. Thank you guys for watching, and after this video I have another video that I want to make that is a little more interesting. It's not a job guide, it's still a guide, but it's something different. You'll see. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys later. Bye bye.